Hello, everybody. How are you doing? Alexander Gordon-Smith here for a brand new Lockdown in Lockdown. Only this time we're not reading Lockdown or anything from Escape from Furnace because I've already done all those. I thought this time we would start reading the last series I wrote, which is called The Devil's Engine. And this was a trilogy of books I wrote. The first one came out in 2015, and it's I don't know how to describe it really. It's very horror. It's incredibly gory, but it's fun too. It's called Hellraisers, the first book, because it's very much in the vein of, I'd say, Clive Barker, who was a massive influence on me when I was a teenager. I used to love reading Clive Barker's books, although they're much more graphic than this one is. And yeah, I think I had the idea. I remember I was walking through the city one night and I must have been listening to some music, and out of nowhere I had this image in my head of this guy running into an underground parking lot, multi-storey underground parking lot, and fighting demons. And there was a girl there too, and they were just fighting demons. And I just thought, oh, that's interesting. Where did that image come from? And I just kind of kept thinking about it and working on it, and then ended up kind of writing this trilogy of books which span a lot of the world and also hell, as you will find out in the last of the series, called Hell Walkers. The middle one's called Hell Fighters. The main character is called Marlowe. He's asthmatic like I am. I've been asthmatic since I was a kid, and I just figured it was an interesting quality to give a character because it makes life very difficult sometimes. I'm probably not going to say much more than that because I'm just going to start reading it. But this is a trilogy I'm really proud of. It was huge for me at the time, because a huge story for me to write, just because it was just this big chunk of lore, L-O-R-E, this kind of mythical lore about what would happen if there was an engine or a machine that could grant you any wish, very much like Faust, the story of Faust. And did I bite off more than I could chew? I may well have bitten off more than I could chew with this trilogy, because it was quite a tough one to write, but I love it and I stand by it, and I think it's a really entertaining story with plenty of violence and monsters and friendship and gore. So anyway, some of you may have read it, and if you haven't, I hope you enjoy this read through. I'll probably only do like 3 chapters every few days, but I haven't read it for ages, so this will be exciting for me too. So the book is called Hellraisers. The first chapter is called Hellraiser. Are you all sitting comfortably? Then I shall begin. That was the trouble with being a Hellraiser. Sometimes you got burned. Marlowe Green knew this better than anyone. How many times has he heard it? From his teachers when he got kicked out of class, from the principals when he got kicked out of schools, from his mum over and over. You set fire to the world and then you run, Marley, she said. And he did. Not literally. Hellraiser, yes. Arsonist, definitely not. But he lit up the world around him, started wildfires that burned through bridges, that sent his friends and his family packing, that spat and roared into his future, destroying it before he could even get there. Then, when it got too hot, he turned and bolted. One of these days you're going to start a fire that can't be put out, his mum had told him. One you can't ever run fast enough to escape. And he'd always wondered when that would be. Always wondered what he'd have to do to ignite an inferno of that magnitude. Turned out the answer to the first question was now. And the second? Yeah, that would be carving a certain part of the male anatomy into the paintwork of his principal's car. They came for him during class. They didn't knock. They just barged in through the door like they were raiding a meth lab instead of math. Half the kids were dozing off, staring out the dirty windows at the blazing June sunshine that drenched Staten Island. The sight of 3 school cops and the principal flooding into the room like a dark, cold current made everyone jump. Green! growled the principal, Mr. Caputo, a scarecrow of a man drowning in his cheap suit. He pointed a blade-like finger at Marlowe. That's him! Oh, crap. The biggest of the three cops pushed his way through the desks. Everyone called him Yogi because he was always confiscating kids' lunches and scarfing them. That and the fact he was a major fat ass. His eyes were two raisins drowning in the doughy flesh of his face, and he smiled wickedly at Marlowe with sausage lips. Got ya. Marlowe blew out a long sigh and sat back in his chair, feeling the heat on his cheeks. He chewed the skin of his knuckles the way he always did when he was stressed, and he wondered whether he should use his inhaler now before things heated up. He decided against it, not wanting to look weak in front of the class. Another cop swept between the desks with an expression like murder. The third stayed by the door, her holster open, her hand on the butt of her pistol. Oh, for the love of... Charlie Alvarez sat at the desk next to Marlowe, running a hand through his mess of dark hair and popping gum. Dude, what did you do now? Me? Marlowe smiled at his best friend, his only friend, coughing to clear his throat. Absolutely nothing. I'm being framed. Yogi stepped in front of the window, blocking the sun and making the room feel 10 degrees colder. He reached out and grabbed a fistful of Marlowe's shirt with his free hand. Get your flabby hands off him, Yogi, yelled Charlie. He didn't do nothing. This isn't your business, Alvarez, Caputo said, turning to Marlowe and doing his best to stab him to death with his eyes. Too far, Mr. Green, he spat, flecks of spittle spraying like gems against the sun. I'm sorry, Marlowe replied as innocently as he could. You've gone too far. There's no way back from this. I'm not sure what you think I did, Marlowe said, feeling his windpipe tighten and cursing his asthma for making him so weak. He snatched in a breath. I'm just sitting in class, minding my own... Get him up, Caputo said. Take him outside. Yogi obeyed, hauling Marlowe out of his chair so hard that it toppled over behind him. Charlie was out of his just as quick, squaring up to the cop, even though he was half his size. That's assault, he said. You've got no right. I said drop it, Alvarez, the principal replied. This idiot isn't worth ruining your life for. Yeah, kid, said Yogi. Sit down. Or what, you going to eat me? The whole class laughed at that, somebody lobbing a crunched up ball of paper at the cop's big, bald head. Yogi glanced at the other two cops, but they just shrugged. Marlowe laughed. He didn't blame them. Charlie was tiny, but he was scary as hell when his blood was up. I'm glad you find this so amusing, the principal said, but I can assure you, you won't be laughing for long. Now move. Yogi yanked Marlowe's shirt and he started walking, coughing hard to release the pressure in his windpipe. Somebody in the class was clapping, and by the time he'd reached the door, there was a full-on round of applause going on, complete with cheers and whistles. He turned and bowed to his audience before being bundled out of the room so abruptly he lost his footing. Yogi and the other two cops hoisted him up, and it was like Marlowe was penned in a prison of black cloth. Somehow the wiry principal managed to squeeze between them. You have no idea how much trouble you're in, Green, he squawked. I still don't know what I'm supposed to have done. So it wasn't you who scratched the hell out of my car? Your car? Marlowe shook his head, trying to hold back the grin that wanted to explode across his face. I didn't even know you had a car. A green Prius, out in the lot. You just admitted to driving a Prius, came Charlie's voice, although Marlowe couldn't see him past the circle of cops. The one that now has something scratched into the hood, something obscene. He showed Marlowe a snapshot on his cell phone. It looks like a rocket ship to me, said Marlowe. And it definitely wasn't my doing. Really? The man leaned towards him, his fists clenched so hard that his knuckles were white. So the fact that it says, by M. Green underneath is a lie, then? The laugh punched up from Marlowe's throat so hard he couldn't hold it back. The truth was, he'd done it that very morning, with his keys, while he was waiting for Charlie to turn up. It wasn't like Caputo didn't deserve it. He'd been on Marlowe's case ever since he arrived at Victor G. Rosemont High School. The principal looked ready to start swinging punches, but instead he turned on his heels and walked briskly down the corridor. Bring him to my office. We have paperwork to fill out. That could only mean one thing. Marlowe chewed his lip, feeling his heart drop into his sneakers. Yeah, raise hell enough and you got burned. He knew that better than anyone. This was his third school in 8 months, after all. They climbed the short flight of steps that led to reception, crossing the foyer, past the security gate with its metal detectors. It had been the same in every other school, the long walk, like he was being marched to his execution down the Green Mile. The only difference this time was the police escort. "Green," said the principal over his shoulder, "I don't know why you're so determined to ruin your life before it has a chance to begin. You're 15 years old and about 3 short steps away from incarceration." Maybe in fairness, penitentiary. "You do understand why you're here, don't you? At this facility?" Yeah, he did. Victor G was the last stop on the road to Loserville. It was the place you went when you'd been chucked out of every other remedial high school in the city, when you'd incinerated every other option. Marlowe felt the familiar pressure in his chest, the storm there starting to rage. He coughed up some phlegm, swallowing hard, then clawed in a breath. "You're a coward, Green. You run away from every shred of responsibility in your life. You burn every bridge. Cowards are not welcome here. If VGR doesn't want you, nowhere else does. And you can be damn sure that VGR does not want you." Marlowe's blood was boiling too fiercely for him to find a reply. Yogi was holding his shirt so tight that it had become a noose around his neck, making it even harder for him to breathe. Charlie trotted along beside them, looking genuinely concerned now. "Are you okay, dude?" he said. "You're going blue." "I'm fine," he wheezed, but that was a lie. He was about as far from fine as it was possible to get. He sucked in some air through the straw of his windpipe, knowing that as soon as he got into the principal's office, it would be over. He'd be giving his marching papers, told to scram. Then it would be home to his mum. Confession time again. "Get back to class, Alvarez, unless you want to go down as an accessory," the principal said. "There will be criminal charges this time, Green. Do you hear me?" Marlowe tugged at his collar. Where the hell was all the oxygen? He eyed the main doors, the glorious sunshine beyond, 20 feet down the hallway, and all he wanted to do was run. Get the hell out of here. Escape while he still could. Charlie had backed off, but caught his eye and shook his head. He knew him way too well. They reached the door to the office, and the principal pushed it open, disappearing into the darkness. Yogi shoved Marlowe in after him. The room beyond was small, barely enough space for a desk and a couple of filing cabinets. It was dark, too, the window boarded over from where somebody had lobbed a brick through it a couple of weeks ago. It was too cramped in here, not enough air. The panic was like a punch to the lungs, paralysing them. Marlowe took a breath, and nothing happened. "Don't seize," he ordered himself, the panic like an acetylene torch behind his eyes. Please, not an attack. He couldn't handle the terror, the ambulance, the rush to get the nebulizer, not on top of everything else. "You do understand what this is?" the principal asked. "You do understand that you're finished here?" Marlowe ignored him, taking a step back towards the door. He reached down to his pocket for the inhaler, and Yogi grabbed his hand. "What have you got in there, kid?" he asked. "Nothing," Marlowe tried to say, producing a sound like a broken accordion. He tried to shake his hand free, but Yogi's grip was a python's. It made his bones feel like snapping. He could hear the cop talking, telling him to calm down, but his heartbeat was loud enough to bring down the walls of the office. It felt like he was being held underwater. Panic made him act before he even knew what he was doing, his hands darting out and slamming into Yogi's chest. The man was made of solid oak, but he was unprepared, the push catching him off balance. He staggered back, letting go of Marlowe, arms cartwheeling wildly. He crashed into the desk, sending papers flying. Marlowe didn't wait to see what happened next. He turned, shouldering past another of the cops, his lungs running on empty. He burst out into the sun-filled hallway, skidding towards the metal detectors, standing sentry just inside the doors. A quick look behind him let him know that they were in pursuit. Charlie stood further down the hallway, back towards the classroom. He waved his arms frantically, mouthing, "Go!" Marlowe nodded to him, then turned, bolting out one of the doors and across the parking lot. He dug the inhaler from his pocket as he went, squeezing off a few shots and feeling his lungs loosen up. The relief of being able to breathe again, so good that he almost didn't hear the doors open behind him. The principal's voice, screaming out, "You're expelled, Green! You hear me? Run all you want. There's no coming back." Marlowe did just that, sprinting past the Prius with its brand new decoration. He spun around as he went. "Nice car, Dick!" And even though he was well and truly burned, even though he could hear his future being flushed, even though it was probably the worst comeback in the history of comebacks, he was grinning as he fled. The next chapter is called Slaughterhouse. Yeah, sorry, I forgot to say this book does have a little bit of swearing in it. So Slaughterhouse, and this is from the other characters. There's 2 points of view in this book. One's Marlowe and one is Pan. "We're in trouble!" Pan didn't need anyone to tell her that. It was pretty damn clear that they were in trouble. Big trouble. They were barrelling down the Cross Island Expressway at 80 miles an hour, the truck roaring like a jet plane. Most of the cars on the road had the good sense to swerve out of their way, but a couple had been shunted off the tarmac by the Ford F-650's custom grille guard. Pan hadn't looked back to see what had happened to them. There were more important things at stake. Her life, for one. She checked her watch. There was no time on the display, just a line of bright red numbers. 00, 00, 32, 21. There were way too many zeros there for her liking. 32 minutes, counting fast. 32 minutes until they came for her. She checked her black Kevlar bodysuit, designed to withstand a close-range shot from a .44 Magnum. Not that it mattered. It wouldn't last 5 seconds against what was coming. "Serious trouble," said the guy sitting next to her. His name was Forrest, although Pam didn't like to think of him as something with a name. It made it too difficult. You didn't name cattle when you sent them to the slaughterhouse. His skin was a nasty shade of grey, coated in sweat, and it wasn't surprising. He'd made his contract 10 minutes before her, so he'd have 10 minutes less on his countdown. He wiped his brow, then sat forward in his seat, looking like he was going to puke. It was Forrest's first mission. And the lawyers were cutting it fine. Way too fine. "Hold it together, guys," said the other man in the back of the truck. Herc. He was mission commander, but he'd commanded Jack on this particular mission. The whole damn thing had gone wrong, and if the lawyers didn't hurry up, then all he or anyone else in the van was good for was a mid-morning snack for hell's hungriest. He rubbed a hand through the grizzled stubble on his chin. "Take the next exit. We've got to get out of sight and rack them up. We're going to need them." Herc pumped a shell into his combat shotgun, and Forrest fumbled with his. They were the best defence they'd found against the demons. Kinda like saying a toothpick was the best defence against a rabid bear, she thought. Pam didn't have a gun. She reached down, felt the crossbow at her feet. Even that wouldn't do much good, not unless the lawyers found a way to end her contract. What the hell was taking them so long? "Ostime," she said into the radio, attached to her armoured suit. There was a permanent open link between her and her employer, Sheppel Ostime. "You guys any closer? We don't exactly have a lot of time here." There was a hiss of static, followed by a voice with a trace of a German accent. "They're going as fast as they can, Pan. This is a tricky nut to crack. Just stay alive. They'll get there." Pan spat out a bitter laugh. "Stay alive? You finally developed a sense of humour, Shep. Any chance of backup?" "Nightingale and truck are inside the engine. Everyone else is airborne. Until then, you're on your own." Great. Everyone jolted in their seats as the truck made contact with something else. The sour stench of fear filled her nostrils, making her want to gag. She and Herc had done this before, but Forrest had only heard stories. The way the world is torn open, the way they swarm out from behind the paper-thin shell of reality. He had a hand over his mouth, his eyes wide and white, the brightest things in the truck. She didn't offer him any words of comfort. What would be the point? Chances were that in less than half an hour, the only evidence he'd ever existed would be his entry in the book of dead engineers. Right next to her own. "Hang on!" yelled the driver, wrestling with the wheel. The truck lurched off the expressway, thumping into the side of the road hard enough to jolt them all off their seats. Pan was pushed back by an invisible hand as they accelerated, her stomach trying to punch its way out past her spine. The world flashing by outside, the tinted windows too fast to see. It didn't matter how fast they were going. They couldn't outrun them. They couldn't escape. They couldn't hide. The only thing that mattered was finding cover where nobody could see what happened next. "Get off the street," Ostheim said, reading her mind. By my calculation," he swore, 20 minutes, Pan, and counting. Fast, get out of sight." The world cannot know. It's the only thing that counts. It's more important than your own life. Ostheim had drilled that into her on day one and every day since. So why the hell were they heading right into the heart of Staten Island? "Out of sight, goddammit!" Herc yelled, grabbing the seat as they smashed into the back of an SUV, sending it spinning out towards the side of the road. Too late, Pan thought, as the driver steered them around a wide bend so fast that the world outside was just a blur. The screeching tyres threw up smoke, and for a second the driver almost lost it. There was a wet, retching sound as Forrest puked over his trousers, but Pan ignored it. There was something else in the air alongside the smell of vomit, a thick, heavy, sulphurous scent that she knew all too well. Their smell. The stench of hell. 20 minutes, Pan," Ostheim repeated, like she hadn't heard him the first time. 20 minutes. 20 minutes between her, Forrest, and an eternity of agony. 20 minutes before they dragged her kicking and screaming down to hell. "Oh, those lawyers better shift their asses," she yelled at Ostheim, cursing herself for the 100th time at least for ever accepting his offer. The engine. The goddamn devil's engine. She'd always known it would be the death of her. And the next chapter is Breathless. Marlowe had jogged a block and a half before he dared to slow down. Crossing the street, he tripped into the alley that ran down the back of the expressway, crashing against a fence. He took another couple of puffs of his inhaler for good measure, feeling the last of the blockage shift. His lungs still ached, though, like he'd breathed in a lungful of pepper spray and run a marathon, not just a few hundred yards. He spat out a wad of phlegm and wiped the sweat from his brow. Only here, in the sudden quiet, just the distant rumble of the city and the eerie wail of a siren, did the events of the last few minutes sink in. Oh, what the hell were you thinking? He was screwed. Not only had he been expelled from the last school that would take him, he'd also committed vandalism and assault on a cop. There was probably an APB out on him by now. The siren he could hear would be a squad car blazing up the street. This was Mariners Harbour. They'd shoot him on sight. His palms stung from where he pushed Yogi, and he rubbed them on his pants, trying to work out a plan. The best thing would be to turn around, head back to the school with his tail between his legs, offer to pay for the paintwork to be redone or something. He could get down on his hands and knees, kowtow his way back to his math class like nothing had ever happened. Yeah, right. There was more chance of him sprouting wings and flying into Harvard. He wiped the sweat from his face, sweat that had less to do with running and more to do with the terror of not being able to breathe. He'd been lucky this time. His asthma was a constant threat, always doing its best to kill him. When he'd been a kid, lying in his bed, writhing back and forth and going blue while his mum called for the ambulance, he'd seen it as a monster, something that wrapped invisible fingers around his throat, whose tongue wormed its way into his windpipe, sealing it tight. Even though he was 15 now, he still carried that beast around with him. It was always on his back, waiting to attack. When it was bad, really bad, it was a battle to the death. The inhaler lost its power. Even the nebulizer he had at home didn't work. It had been close today. A couple more minutes, maybe, and the principal would have been calling 911 and giving him mouth to mouth. Maybe that would have been better. You couldn't exactly expel someone who was dying on your office floor. Marlowe shook his head. What was he going to tell his mum? "Please, Marlowe," he heard her say, as clear as if she was standing next to him. There had been enough Bacardi on her breath that day to make his eyes sting. "Please, just this once. Be good. I can't stand it. I can't stand the trouble. I need you to do this for me. Stay in school." And he had been. He'd been doing okay. It was just that douchebag principal riding him every day. This was all Caputo's fault. Maybe he should go back and teach the man a proper... Footsteps, hard and fast, rising up from the end of the alleyway. Marlowe pushed himself off the wall, fists clenched. Oh, please not the cops, please not the cops. He had half turned, not sure if his lungs could stand another sprint, when Charlie's face appeared. When he saw Marlowe, he flinched. Then he broke into a sweaty grin, skidding to a halt with his hands on his knees. Marlowe swore. Oh, Jesus, Charlie, where'd you come from? Oh, they were all so busy chasing after you, I couldn't resist slipping out behind them. Then they were both laughing, sniggering nervously, just in case somehow the cops could hear them half a mile away. Oh, man, you should have seen it back there. It was utter chaos. I can't believe you punched Yogi. I didn't punch him, Marlowe said. His fat ass just fell over. What happened? It sounded like all hell had broken loose in there. I had to go look. Yogi was on the desk and the desk was on the floor. The whole thing had snapped in two. He was rolling around like a turtle. Funniest thing I ever saw. Then they were after you. Charlie had to stop to catch his breath. He was laughing so hard. Best part is, Yogi came out of the office so hard he nearly knocked me over, ran straight into one of his guys and ended up flat on his face, and he was rolling around all over again. Took the other cops and Caputo to pick him up. Man, I almost died laughing. Did they come after you too? Marlowe asked. Charlie shook his head. Nah, don't exactly look like a threat, do I? Understatement of the century. Charlie was a year older than Marlowe, but 5'3" and stick thin. The phrase can't punch his way out of a wet paper bag was invented for him, although anyone who thought that would be wrong. Charlie was a pit bull. He wouldn't just tear his way out of a wet paper bag, he'd shred it, set fire to it, and stamp the ashes into oblivion. Spending 3/4 of your life in foster care would do that to you. Oh, besides, Caputo loves me. I'm one of his model students, turning my life around, getting back on track. They used me in the brochure, remember? You, though... Charlie shook his head again, sighing. That was a pretty stupid thing to do, Marlowe, even for you. What made you scratch that on the principal's car? It was a rocket ship, Marlowe muttered. Charlie cracked a smile, but it slipped off his face after a second or two. Seriously, dude, what are you going to do now? Marlowe didn't answer. He just turned and walked down the alley. Best thing to do to a question like that? Turn your back on it. Charlie scampered after him, his feet kicking up gravel. Marlowe, I'm not kidding. You've got to start facing up to things. I am, Marlowe said. I hated that place anyway. So you're bolting again. You're running out of places to go. Going to be prison or the army at this rate. Not the army. No way. Marlowe closed his eyes, thought of Danny. He barely even remembered his brother, but he saluted his yellowing, faded photo, full combat gear, bleached in desert sun, on the kitchen wall every single day. He'd done so ever since he was 5 years old and his brother hadn't come home. Once upon a time, all he'd ever wanted to be was a Marine like Danny. Maybe that way his mum would look at him, the same way she did that photo, with love. Then he thought of the empty coffin, the flag draped over it, folded by the honour guard and handed over to his mother at the funeral. Cowards can't be soldiers, his brain said, and he stared up at the sun to try to burn the words away. They're hiring up at the concrete plant, Charlie said, kicking a crushed can into a section of fence. Not great, but at least it'll keep you out of trouble. He snorted. Though trouble always seems to find you. Picking a fight with Yogi Bear. I've seen you do worse, Marlowe said, looking at his friend. The first time he'd met Charlie, the kid had been in a fight with 2 college jocks over in Tottenville. He'd been outnumbered and outgunned, but he'd been given as good as he got. They both ended up bolting, holding their bloodied noses. Charlie probably would have chased them halfway across the state if Marlowe hadn't stepped in to hold him back. He'd almost gotten a black eye for his trouble. I'm the very definition of sweetness and light, Charlie said. Where are we going now? Marlowe pulled his cell from his pocket and checked the time. It was nearly 11. He half thought about calling his mum, telling her on the phone. It was better than seeing her face crumple, watching the tears fall, but he couldn't face her, not even on the phone. It wasn't the anger that worried him. He dealt with that all the time. No, it was the disappointment. He needed some Dutch courage before he spoke to her. I'm going to go celebrate my newfound freedom, he said, flashing a bitter smile at Charlie. No more school, man, just sunshine and partying. Want to join me? Getting hammered before lunch. That's your big plan? They exited the alleyway onto Park, a solid line of traffic bleating like robotic sheep and pumping out fumes. Marlowe coughed, feeling the tickle again, the beast slipping its fingers around his throat. Oh, man, he hated this city. Hated the cars, hated the schools, hated the people. Marlowe, Charlie said, reaching out and grabbing his shirt, sorry. You don't want to end up like your mum, like my old man. He shrugged loose, the anger burning up inside him like the sun. I'll be fine, he said, walking off so that Charlie wouldn't see the fire reach his face. Just go back, just do your thing, live your life. Push, push, push. It's all he seemed to do sometimes. Yeah, real fine, said Charlie. Go and have a morning cocktail, Marlowe. Run away like you always do. There was the sound of scuffing heels as he made his way back into the alley. Then his voice again. You know, Caputo is right about one thing. You're too scared to face up to anything. Do yourself a favour, Marlowe. Grow some cojones. Then he was gone. Marlowe stood there, wanting to chase after him, but standing his ground. Sometimes people don't push back. Sometimes you push them so hard, they fall right out of your life. Oh, who cares, he muttered to himself. I'll be fine. But it was starting to dawn on him that maybe he wouldn't. Collateral damage. 0000 22 21. 22 minutes. Pan checked her watch again, swore time was going twice as fast as it should be. She even tapped the watch face like it was broken. Oh, you wish. It was a custom model, waterproof, bomb-proof, bulletproof. The only thing it wasn't was demon-proof. The truck lurched, ripping her back into the real world. They were off the expressway and smashing through traffic like a demolition derby. Too many people watching them with eyes like pickled eggs. Too many CCTV cameras picking them up. Pan could hear sirens rising over the growl of the engine. That was bad. Really bad. The driver reached the end of the road and wrenched up the handbrake like he was trying to rip it off. The truck skidded to the left, vibrating hard enough to shake them all to pieces. For a second it lifted onto two wheels, the whole thing on the verge of toppling. Pan swore, clutching her seat to stop herself from sliding into Forrest. The driver flicked the wheel and the truck levelled with a bump. They had to get into hiding, fast. The consequences of staying in plain sight were bad, worse even than the thought of what would happen to her in 22 minutes. She checked her watch. 21. She swore, leaning forward, scanning the road ahead. There was nothing but apartment blocks rising on both sides like tombstones. The truck was doing 70, bludgeoning its way past the traffic. Come on, give us a break. Are they going to crack it, right? Asked Forrest. The kid was covered in his own puke and shaking hard. He was the same age as her, 17, but right now he looked half that. A little boy who'd suddenly found himself miles away from home with no idea how he got there. Pan didn't know much about him other than his name. That was the way she liked it. In this business, people died. Simple as that. It was easier if they were strangers. You need to focus, she said. Let the lawyers worry about your contract. Seriously, Hal growled at the driver. Herc growled at the driver. If you don't get this hunk of junk into cover right now, I'm going to throw you out the door. Just remember, you're a soldier. A Hellraiser, Pan said to Forrest. You can fight them, the demons. You traded for strength, right? He nodded. Then just punch them. It would be like fighting a tide. They'd keep coming. Nothing could stop them. But at least this way they'd have hope. He'd have hope. She lifted her crossbow to check that it was ready to use. The weapon was over 300 years old, but it was still as good as new. The bolt in the chamber was iron, taken from the engine itself. Not as intimidating as a shotgun, but it was loaded with something far older and far more powerful than buckshot. The demons were coming to collect, sure, but that didn't mean she was going to pay up without a fight. You need me to speak with anyone? Herc asked. It was the last thing she wanted to hear. Herc knew better than anyone that there was nobody for him to speak to. She ignored him, focusing on the road, on the endless barriers of buildings on either side. The truck was doing 50 now, slowed down by the thick stream of traffic clogging the street. The grill guard was doing its job, but sooner or later it was going to run into something bigger than it, and that would be that. They'd be stranded in the middle of America's most densely populated city. Pan, your mum, I can find her, I can tell her. She reached out and slapped her gloved hand over his mouth. There was no need, because the glare she shot at him would have shut him up by itself. Herc, stop talking. I'm not planning on dying today. 0000 1923. Her watch had other plans. What about you, kid? Herc said to Forrest. The boy looked back, his wide eyes full of terror. You told me this wouldn't happen, he said, his quiet voice almost lost. His quiet voice almost lost beneath the roar of the engine. You said the lawyers could crack it. They will, said Pan, trying to give him a reassuring look. She caught a glimpse of his watch. Less than 10 minutes. She keyed the radio. "Oss time, we could really do with some help right now." "Not long, Pan. They've almost got it." The truck thumped up onto the curb, somebody screaming as they dived out of its path. It rammed into a hydrant, water blasting into the sun and filling the street with rainbows. Rainbows that flickered with red and blue light. "Oh, crap." "Cops!" yelled the driver. Sure enough, the rear window was filled with light, a blue and white squad car blazing up behind them. "Get the caltrops out," Hurt roared, and when nobody responded, he ploughed his way to the back of the truck. He grabbed a duffel bag and unzipped it, kicking open the rear doors and lobbing it out. The mechanism inside the bag activated, unleashing a string of razor wire and sending it spinning out across the asphalt. The cop car braked, but not before it tore across the wire, all 4 tyres exploding. Then it was on its side, rolling hard, bouncing into the parked cars along the edge of the road. Pan turned back to the front, part of her wondering if the cops inside were still alive, part of her trying not to care. 2 lives are nothing compared to what might happen if the world finds out about us, she forced herself to think. Collateral damage, just collateral damage. If she kept saying it, then it had to be true. "Oh, we have to get off the road," Herc said, his eye almost popping out of his head. "We have to find..." The wall of buildings on the left-hand side of the road split, plunging them back into the sun. Pan squinted, seeing a bigger building behind a screen of trees. There was a gate there, and beyond it the road swept down into the mouth of a tunnel. Oh, an underground parking lot. It was their only shot. "There!" she said, pointing over the driver's shoulder. He panicked, turning the wheel too early, blasting a gatepost to brick dust as the truck slammed through. Then they were in the shade, swallowed whole by the tunnel. Pan's ears popped, a change in pressure that had nothing to do with being underground. A spark ripped across the inside of the truck, so bright that it left its mark on her retinas, made her short hair stand on end. The sulphurous smell was stronger here, a haze of smoke already pooling around their feet. The truck skidded down the spiral ramp, scraping the concrete walls, and spat out into the first level of the parking lot. The driver slammed on the brakes, and they screeched to a halt. The lights in the ceiling were flickering wildly, more sparks tearing the air around them. The whole building shook and groaned like a sinking ship. The demons were always powerful, but this time there were 2 souls on the table, and they were hungry. They would demolish half of New York trying to collect. "Go, go, go!" she yelled. Hurt kicked open the doors at the back of the truck and hopped down, his shotgun at the ready. Even though Pan had been in this situation countless times, she still felt like screaming, fear turning her body hollow. She fought it, grabbing the seats and literally hauling herself towards the doors. The lights in the parking lot gave up, exploding into sparks and flooding the world with darkness. "Tubes!" she shouted, ripping a light stick from her belt and lobbing it out the doors. It flickered on, burning fiercely, making the parking lot swim like it was at the bottom of an ocean of blood. "You 2, said Herc, pointing a finger inside the van and flashing them both a warning look. "Stay here." He turned, slotting spare shells into the shotgun and pumping one into the barrel. It was getting hot down here, really hot, the air shimmering like they were inside a furnace. She glanced at her watch again. Barely 10 minutes left to live if the lawyers didn't get their asses in gear. 10 minutes, then she was worse than dead. Collateral damage. "Listen to Herc," said Hostheim's voice in her ear, the signal broken up by the layers of concrete overhead. "Do not leave the vehicle." "Yes, sir," she replied. Then she checked her crossbow, took a deep breath, and threw herself out of the doors into the nightmare of blood and fire. We'll do one more. Drowning sorrows. Charlie was right. For someone who couldn't jog 10 paces without reaching for his inhaler, Marlowe did a lot of running. Marlowe did a lot of running. Not sprinting, not jogging, not running a marathon. No, his kind of running was the other kind. He never ran towards anything. He ran away from everything. "It's what cowards do," said his head. He'd been 5 when Danny had died, so he couldn't remember what his brother's voice sounded like. He was pretty sure this was him, though. The big brother whose ghost lived inside his mind. "Oh, shut up," he whispered to him. "You ran away as soon as you were old enough to enlist." "Oh, needed to get the hell away from Mum," came the reply. Marlowe put his head down and engaged autopilot. He didn't know where he was going. He didn't care. As long as he kept moving, he didn't have to think about anything. Didn't have to think about what he was going to tell his mum. Didn't have to think about what he was going to do with his life. He crossed the street, the sunlight boring holes in his skull, blinding him. A truck tore past, close enough to touch, cocooning him in exhaust fumes. Its horn bellowed, deep and loud, making his bones tremble. "What are you going to tell her?" Danny asked, inside his head. He had no idea. It wasn't like she gave a happy crap what he did with his life. She spent all day in her rum and coke bubble. All she ever talked about was how proud she was of Danny, how much she missed him, how Marlowe could never fill his brother's army boots no matter how hard he tried. Not that he was interested in trying. No. Better to run. Better to keep your head down, your ears closed, your mouth shut. Run and find a good place to hide. His mum had found a home in a Bacardi bottle. Marlowe was pretty sure he'd be comfortable there too. He looked up. No idea where he was. There was a main road up ahead though, and he marched towards it. He turned left, weaving between the crowds of kids skipping school and mums with strollers. An auto centre, a nail parlour, a pizza joint, and there, so small he almost missed it, the faded green canopy of a corner bodega. Oh, perfect. He started to cross, pulling back when an ambulance barrelled past, sirens screaming. Another followed. They skidded right up ahead, disappearing behind the buildings. Now that he was tuned into it, he could make out more sirens, the air swimming with them. Not that that was unusual, of course. This was New York City. It was the day you didn't hear any sirens that you knew you were totally screwed. The traffic broke, and he jogged across the street. The bodega looked more like a prison than a store, bars tight against the windows and half a dozen cameras aimed out at the sidewalk. There was a huddle of guys smoking cigarettes outside, and they eyeballed him hard enough to make him stop, think about turning around. Then one of them laughed at something and they looked away, and Marlowe stomped the last few paces and crashed through the door. Inside, it looked even more like a prison. A single chest-high shelf running to the back of the store, teeming with rows of dusty canned goods, beat-up refrigerators against the walls, stocked with juice, soda and beer. The aisles crammed with flimsy displays loaded with chips and other junk. Up front, a small deli area, and behind the plexiglass, a counter with lotto tickets, cigarettes, candy within an easy snatch of the cash register. It took his eyes a while to adjust to the gloom, the window bars keeping the sunlight out but trapping the heat and dust inside. It was like a sauna in here, and he had to ease his inhaler out of his pocket, firing off a blast to stop his lungs from rattling. He grabbed a 40-ounce bottle of malt liquor from one of the coolers, but he could feel somebody watching him, and he was suddenly aware of how he looked, stooped and pouting like a sulky child. He straightened up to his full 5'10", clearing his throat, jangling the coins in the pocket of his sweatpants the way he'd seen older guys do. He strode as confidently as he could to the front of the store, stopping at the newspaper rack to pick up a copy of the Daily News, figuring it would make him look older. Gradually, a face became visible behind the glass, a woman who had to have been around when they signed the Declaration of Independence. She was so small she could barely see over the counter, but she had fire in her eyes, and right now she looked like she was trying to make Marlowe spontaneously combust. He coughed nervously and put the bottle and the newspaper in the hatch. The old lady didn't move. "Just these, please," he said, sounding like a church mouse. He looked at the counter, at the wall, at the ceiling, at his shoes, and then finally at the old lady. "Sure, kid," she said with a thick accent that he couldn't place. "Why don't I grab you some smokes and a lotto ticket? Make it a party." Marlowe felt every liquid ounce of blood rise to his face. "It's not for me, it's for my wife. She asked me to pick it up on the way home from my job." He thought for a moment that the woman was going to choke to death from laughing. She wiped her eyes with a leathery hand. "Oh, all right, we wouldn't want to disappoint the wife," she said when she'd recovered herself. "What's her name?" Marlowe reached into his head for a name and found nothing there. He stared at the front page of the paper, an article on Rio. Brazil, he said. "Brasilia." "Oh, Brasilia," said the woman, nodding. "She sounds beautiful. Where did you meet?" Marlowe struggled again. "Look, I'm in a hurry. It's been a bad day. Can I just pay for these and get going? The chime above the door rang out and the woman's head jerked up, her hand reaching under the counter. She probably had a bat or something under there, although Marlowe had no idea what good it would do her. She was surely too small to lift it. She quickly relaxed, and Marlowe glanced over his shoulder to see a couple of women walk inside, chatting furiously in Spanish. Through the open door he could hear more police blazing past on the street, sirens shrieking. "Trouble outside," said the woman, all shaking her head. "Always trouble." "Yeah," said Marlowe, tugging his wallet out of his sweats. It was black and red, and when he pulled apart the Velcro fastener, he felt like he was 10 years old. There was a 20 inside and a bunch of ones. He took the 20 and slapped it down in the hatch. "This cover it?" "Sure, kid. Want to pull your ID out of there while you're at it?" Marlowe looked at his wallet, then back up at her. "It's... let me guess. In your other wallet," she said, folding her arms across her chest. Marlowe opened his mouth to answer, but she cut him off again. "Nah, the dog ate it. It's in your wife's handbag. Aliens abducted it. You left it at the office." "All of the above?" Marlowe said, with what he hoped was a charming smile. He thought the woman might have fallen for it, but the distant roar of an engine filled the room, a crunch of metal, squealing brakes. Was that a scream, muffled by the walls of the store? She looked over his shoulder, shaking her head. "Better not be your trouble, kid," she said. Marlowe shook his head, standing aside as the two women walked to the counter and bought gum. He half thought about just turning and bolting with a bottle. It wasn't like the cashier would be able to catch him. His lungs had already taken a beating, though, and by the time he was even halfway to working up the courage, the women had gone, and he was alone with the clerk again. He pinched the top of his nose, an ache brewing in his skull. "Oh, look, it's been a really bad day. I just want to forget it." "Kid, you're young. You're healthy. You wouldn't know a bad day if it bit you on the ass. No ID, no booze. I'll sell you that newspaper and a bag of Skittles, and you can count yourself as lucky as the angels. Deal?" Marlowe looked at the bottle, licking his lips as he imagined the peace that lay inside. "Oh, lady, please." "Lady?" said the woman. "You call me a lady?" She leaned in towards the glass, and this close her wrinkled face seemed to take on a more masculine appearance. "Oh, crap. Oh, sorry, man, it's..." "Go on," the little guy yelled, banging a gnarled fist on the glass. "Get out of here before I..." Something outside exploded. Not so much a sound as a tremor that rocked through the store and into Marlowe's bones, almost knocking him clean onto his ass. He gripped the counter hard, doing his best to clamp his jaws around the scream. The shockwave punched open the door, a roar like thunder pouring in from the outside world. One of the windows imploded in a spray of sun-drenched shrapnel. Behind the glass, the cashier almost fell off his stool. "Holy Jesus Christ!" he grunted, propping one hand on the counter and reaching under it with the other. When he came up again, it wasn't a bat he was holding. It was a shotgun, sawn off and double-barreled. He pointed it right at Marlowe, finger on the trigger, everything shaking. "Hey!" Marlowe said, hands over his head, his heart jackhammering against his ribs. His ears were ringing. There was a smell in the air, not smoke, but something worse, something that smelled like old eggs and acid. "You better tell me what the hell's going on," the bodega guy said, his eyeballs practically bursting out of their sockets. His greasy hair was defying gravity, stretching up towards the ceiling like it was trying to make a getaway. Marlowe could feel something on his skin, some kind of electric charge. "I swear to God, I'll cut you down right here and make your imaginary wife an imaginary widow." Another sound was filtering through the chaos. The pop, pop, pop of gunshots. "It's nothing to do with me," Marlowe said, staring into the big, empty eyes of the shotgun. He wondered if bulletproof glass worked both ways. "I swear I have no idea. I just wanted a drink." "Yeah, some coincidence that. Go on, get out of here." Marlowe backed away. Another siren wailed past outside, louder now that the door was open. The dust was aggravating his asthma, shutting everything down again. He tried to cough open his windpipe, reaching down for his inhaler. The man said. "Hands where I can see him until you're out the door." Marlowe backed off, his arms stretched out to his sides. He'd made it 4 feet when another explosion rocked through the store, this one powerful enough to knock him to his knees. His vision flashed white, so bright that it felt like a physical force against his retinas. He used a shelf to pull himself up, lumps of ceiling smashing down around him like hail. The cashier opened his mouth, Seemed like he was going to shout something at Marlowe, but he never got the chance. The ceiling above him split in an avalanche of plaster and beams. 1 second he was there, the next he was buried. Marlowe waved the dust away, ignoring the pain in his lungs, running to the counter. There was a door to the side, knocked ajar by the blast, but wedged tight with rubble. He shouldered it open. There was no sign of the clerk except for a hand and a leg beneath the debris. Marlowe reached out, a jagged spark of electricity leaping from the man's flesh to his own, but he felt no sign of a pulse. Oh, God! Marlowe held the man's limp hand for a moment more, trying to will him back to life. The remains of the ceiling groaned. At this rate, the whole building was going to collapse, so he clambered onto the bar again, retreating only when he remembered the shotgun. He dived down, snatched it up, spying a box of shells behind the bar and tipping as many as he could into his pockets. If things were as bad as they sounded, then he was going to need all the firepower he could get. Marlowe took one last look at the dead clerk's hand. That could have been me. Then he sprinted across the empty room, slipping on the dust and rubble, once again running as fast as his sneakers would let him. And I think we'll probably leave it there today. We'll start tomorrow with a nice big action scene. Plenty of death. I hope you enjoyed that. I love this book. Action and horror and a bit of comedy as well. Marlowe, very much based on me when I was a teenager. I was a bit of a Hellraiser myself, so I kind of know what it's like. Never got expelled, but got in a lot of trouble. But so I hope you enjoyed that. I will try and upload another one tomorrow, but it might not be tomorrow. It might be over the weekend sometime. We'll gradually get through the whole trilogy. Let me know what you think in the comments, and I will see you all very soon. Hope you're all well, and I hope you have a wonderful weekend, or indeed whatever day this might be for you. And take care. Bye.